Yeah, so we are going to, I guess, ignore this little red box here for a second and hope it goes away. But at least we can start out with a good joke where we have a failure of trying to persist state about a talk about the source and flow of that state. So many bugs and so many issues and so many of the fun or not so fun parts of our days involve this. So yeah, we're going to be talking about single source of truth and unidirectional data flow. And I'm also going to be talking a little bit about myself and my background, and hopefully we have a pretty fun time along the way. And thank you so much for being here. So I want to talk a little bit about what I was before, or at least what I did before I was a programmer. So I was a musician, sort of jack of all trades in music, and I got into that field by studying music formally at a university. I auditioned, I joined up, and I wanted to become a jazz musician. And one of the first of things that I started learning was that there are these things called scales that you play on, a guitar, if you were playing a guitar, which is what I was doing. And I had thought there was two of them, and there was major scales that were for happiness, and there were minor scales that were for sadness. And then I showed up and they're like, actually, there's a million of them. They're called modes. And they have these, let's accept the terms. We've all been hacked, but the red box went away. So they have these cool and interesting names: Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, Locrian. And I was like, okay, those sound like really normal, like English words. I'm sure that I'll figure this out. And I have always been kind of a person who never really left that stage of like 2-year-olds where you just ask the nearest authority figure or adult why until they can't anymore. And I never really grew out of that. And so I started trying to figure that out. And I learned about two folks named Miles Davis and John Coltrane. And these, if you get nothing else out of this talk, maybe listen to one or both of these albums. And they created this thing called modal jazz. And it was kind of about just like getting into a groove where you just explored like a specific harmonic area. And I was like, that sounds kind of cool, but I always thought jazz was like super complicated and you jumped around from like chord to chord and you had to play super fast over all this stuff. So how did this happen? And it turns out it was a reaction to sort of that era of jazz. And I was like, okay, cool, that makes sense, but I still have no idea why these things are called like Lydian and Mixolydian, and like, did the Mixos come from the Lydians or what happened there? And so then I learned that it turns out that those names were appropriated during the medieval times when folks were like doing all these crazy Gregorian chants to celebrate like a morning or an evening or a specific type of worship they were doing. And I was like, okay, I guess that kind of makes sense, but these don't really sound like Latin and they don't really sound like Romance languages, so what were clerics and monks in the medieval times doing with these weird names? And so then I dug a little bit further, and it turns out there's this book called Plato's Republic, and in Plato's Republic, he was pretty upset because the Greek folks had murdered his friend and mentor, and maybe imaginary friend and imaginary mentor, we don't really know. And so he wrote this book about how to make a society that wouldn't murder your friend or imaginary mentor called the Republic. And in it, he talked about music. And it turns out there's some types of music that make you feel sad, like minor scales, and there's some types of music that make you feel happy, like major scales. And he gave those things names based upon, as we assume, some of the names of the people who lived there at the time, which were like the Dorians and the Lydians, and apparently the Mixolydians that weren't like creative enough to come up with just their own name of where they were from and based it off of the Lydians or the other way. We don't really know. And so I kind of realized that going through this process that these names and these scales that I was learning at university really had no basis in reality or truth whatsoever. They had been picked up by folks who read a book that was describing instruments that they had never heard, that was describing musical scales and well, maybe scales and tunes that had never been written down because musical notation was not invented. And then they co-opted it to feel smart. And then people kept doing that all the way down the line until these magical albums kind of blew and Love Supreme came out. And they really wanted to explain in intellectual terms what the magic was behind that music. And they grabbed on to these very intellectual phrases that had been grabbed onto by intellectuals from the dawn of all time. So that's kind of an interesting thing, but now we're going to talk a little bit about the current state of data flow in modern applications. And this is going to be mostly centered around React, but since modern Angular, Vue, and their cohorts have basically stabilized around a component hierarchical system, this is not going to be like code specific to React. And so, what is single source of truth? What is unidirectional data flow? Well, the idea is this. You have a parent component like this one on top, and its job is figuring out what its children needs and passing them that data. And then those children have children, and they get passed data, and those children have children, and everybody has children, and then all of a sudden you have data passing. And the important thing is that there's no arrows that go up. There's only arrows that go down. And the cool thing about this is that we're able to take discrete pieces of UI, and we can co-locate the markup that is going to be used to describe the semantical meaning of the elements there. We can co-locate the styling, and we can co-locate the behavior. And the core principle here is that we never pass data back up. And so this ends up with like a little bit of a problem, because sometimes you need to share, let's say, data from this component way over here at the bottom to that component way over there on the other side. And this is a problem that I'm pretty sure most of us, if not all of us, have come across. And the classic way to solve this is that you first identify the core minimal data representation of your application, which I'm sure is something that all of you do in the first week of your new job. And then we identify where that data is used in every component, which I'm sure is something that each of us does every time we open up a PR that touches any bit of state, or when we want to add a new piece of state. And then we lift that state up to the highest common ancestor, which can be, in some of the applications that I've worked on, 50 components, 100 components, maybe 1,000 components up, depending upon whether your team has decided to live with the pain of 2,000 line components or 2,001 line components. And then if you can't find a component that makes sense, just make an arbitrary state holding component and put it somewhere above those components to give it to it. So this works. It's not the most elegant solution that I've ever seen written down in my life, but it works pretty well. And in response to that, people being like, there has to be a more elegant way, started coming up with some third-party solutions or methodologies. One of the first of these was Flux. The idea with Flux is that you create a whole bunch of stores. Those stores will hold key domain pieces of your data, and they'll inject that data into pieces of your application. One of the problems with that is that just like the sibling components need to talk, sometimes the sibling stores need to talk. And so how do we do that? Well, we asynchronously tell one store to not perform a computation until our store finishes it. Well, it turns out, thread locking, asynchronous stuff like that has never been super easy for anybody, and it's never actually turned out really well. And this is kind of what we were re-implementing in the front end without the benefit of having different CPUs. And so since this was just purely an organizational philosophy, it didn't last very long, and it got replaced with this idea of Redux, which has been propagated out to different applications. Redux gets used in Angular sometimes. Vuex is over there. There's a bunch of these. And so Redux says, the problem was the stores were talking to each other, and so we're going to have one store. But then you still need to divide up the domain business of your logic into different little pieces. And so we find a logical unit to do that, and we call it a reducer, and then we call it a day, and there were no more state bugs, and all of us just get to focus on using and creating very useful and beautiful user interfaces all day long, and our product people are happy, and we get every Friday off, right? Well, not quite. So then there was this thing called context. The React team for a long time was like, hey, never, ever, ever use this. It's going to change. And then it never changed, and then it was okay for us to use it, which was pretty cool. And I like to call the context provider solution Redux without the dev tools, which is not nothing, because Redux has a footprint. But so this is tongue in cheek. And I say all these things and I make these jokes because I want to make you laugh, and it's fun being sardonic. But I do love these technologies, and I enjoy working with them every day. But I do think, hey, if you're using Context Provider and then you have like a million contexts and around your app, and then they need to talk to each other, you might have reinvented Flux without the tooling. And then if you have one and it's a singleton, you might have reinvented Redux without the tooling. So just think about that. And so then I thought to myself, well, this is clearly not a solved space. Maybe I should do something about it. And I was reminded of this XKCD comic, and also kind of how we wanted to dig into how we got there in the first place. So I remember reading on the React docs when they first came out that React is the view in the model view controller. And I was like, what the heck is that? And so I decided to start digging into it. And it turns out MVC was originally coined by this guy named Trvig, apologies for the pronunciation, who was working on Smalltalk 79 in the 1970s, 50 years ago, goodness gracious. And Trvig was working on UIs that looked like this, which is basically the same thing that we do every day, all day long, right? And so we decided to take that philosophy and see if it applies to what we do. So what does that philosophy do? Well, we have a controller, we have a model, and a view. And the controller just is like the king of the castle, the queen of the castle, and it coordinates the organization and the laying out of the views. So in a class-based thing, you have this controller class, it gets instantiated first, it instantiates a model, it passes that model over to the view, and then when the view wants to display something like the name of a user, it calls like get user name on the model instance that it has passed to it. And so the model is a pure data representation of the view, and the view is just a visual representation of the model. And the goal for this was that when they were developing Smalltalk, they had this problem where it was like really difficult to test things because the business logic was tied up in the presentation logic, which I'm sure is something that we've never heard or felt before. And then and then they started like ending up with these views that had like layout, but then also had like all of these, 1,000-line functions, which is also something that I'm sure a pain that we've never felt before. And so they were like, let's separate these things out and like give ourselves some logical places to put them. Okay, great. So then, if we fast forward to kind of like the early 2000s, this guy named Martin Fowler took the MVC idea and said, okay, like what if it's not a controller, it's a presenter. And as a presenter, who's trying not to be super controlling, I think this is a cool idea. But the view and the model stay basically the same, but the presenter retrieves data from the model, formats it from the view, acts upon events from the view. And so the goal of this was to further remove any kind of business logic from the view. And so we're trying to like just tear any code whatsoever. And so in this place, the view still has to do a little bit of code, but it's basically just, hey, who's my model? And like, where's the data from that model? So then we get, in what I think is a dark turn of events, we still have a 3-letter acronym here, MVV, but this third acronym is view model, which is a word that I wasn't able to find in the English dictionary. But there's actually something pretty cool here, which is it's the like complete removal of all logic from the view. And so the view becomes this like stateless templated markup and styling situation, and there's no code in there. There's no backing code. It doesn't even have to wire itself up. And so how does this happen? Well, this thing called data binding happens. And so instead of having the view say explicitly, get me this data from that model, it just references a value, and that value in the view model part of the application is directly bound to the same value in the model. And so the cool part about that is that when you update anything in the model, the stuff that you see in the view gets updated without you as the developer having to write code. The bad thing about it is sometimes you show up to work and somebody updated the model, and then you have to figure out why your view doesn't work anymore. And this was honestly what I thought was sort of like the death knell of AngularJS. And it kind of was culturally, but I don't think technically. The next iteration of this is model view whatever. And if you go to the AngularJS website today, you will still see this, a super heroic model view whatever framework. And I think this is basically the sign of the death knells of us trying to like take this idea that worked, I think, really well in the 70s. Everybody loves Smalltalk that I think is like exposed to it, but it wasn't working super well. for us. And Igor Miner, who was working on the Angular team in like 2012, gave a talk at Angular where he said, look, everybody is arguing about whether this is MVC, whether this is MPC, whether this is MVVW, whatever. The point is that we're all writing super cool stuff with Angular, and we should stop arguing about it. And so he said that he was officially declaring AngularJS to be a model view whatever. And I think this is actually Igor Minar, thank you. The interesting thing about this is that when Turvig originally came up with MVC, he didn't call it MVC. He called it Model, View, Editor, and Thing. And his colleagues said that's not a really marketable philosophy. and so they changed it to Model View Controller. But I think that this point where we kind of devolve into Model View whatever is showing that there are kind of like things in here that aren't being accounted for by this technology. And at the point that Angular is called a model view whatever, we still notably have controllers in the Angular source code. So they're there. And I think that this version of Angular is probably the closest, like philosophically, to the original model view editor thing, where model is model, view is view, controller is editor, and thing is scope. Scope was the glue that bound everything together, and sometimes the super glue that we were frantically Googling how to unbind. So superheroic model view whatever. And where does that leave us in terms of what happened with React? Well, React kind of like did this jujitsu move, and it just said like, hey, I'm not going to fight you like straight on, or maybe it's judo, maybe it's a form of martial art, Aikido or something that I don't know as much about. But they said, well, instead of fighting you directly, we're just going to ignore the model and the controller parts about this, and we're going to say that React isn't a framework, it's a library, and it's a view library, and that you can do whatever you want with the model and the controller according to your own software architecture. And that was pretty cool and pretty interesting. And I think let us dig into the results of like landing in this component hierarchy system. And it's hard to remember this actually, but when React was first presented, it was actually met with a great deal of scorn. And so there were a lot of people that were not very excited about including XML-like syntax inside of JavaScript. There was a lot of people that weren't really excited about learning an alternative to HTML, an open standard for a different open standard, JSX. There was a lot of people that had ingrained in them this idea that models are where the pure representation of your data go. Controllers are the things that decide which view gets which model, and maybe there's a little bit of routing logic or something in there. And then the view is where you have this completely stateless, beautiful, declarative markup. And I think rightly so, they were kind of like, well, if it's the view, what are we going to do with the data of our application? Like a lot of times, HTML and CSS or the layout and markup that you're using, even in native development, can be extremely challenging. But it's not like, most of the time you can be like, hey, I forgot how to center a div, and you can Google centering a div. Or you can be like, hey, I'd love to put some box shadow on this, and you can Google how to put some box shadow. But if you try just Googling, hey, my state is in a mess, what do I do about it? Then it's like a little bit harder to figure that out. And so I would argue that React is still basically the view in the model view controller, and that while many of us have decided that we're not super into Flux and we're not super into Redux, we are left with a situation where our responsibility is to take a look at this amorphous business logic, which from like the React team and from the best that I know, we don't really have a better solution than hoisting the state to a shared parent component that provides this messaging around, or to use context provider or some other solution that leverages the context provider tooling underneath the belt. But that doesn't mean that the problems associated with state or the difficulties associated with state have gone away. And so I want to go back to our friends Miles Davis and John Coltrane, particularly John Coltrane, and modal music. And so modal music was this idea that instead of like jumping around like every like quarter note or every, as fast as you can think at a breakneck speed to like an entire new harmonic fantasy land and improvising over that, they were just going to stay and explore what it feels like to really be in the zone of this one harmonic land. And to me, that feels like there's a pretty direct parallel between that and superheroic model view, whatever. It's kind of like saying, like, you know what? We've been like mired in like this very rigid like philosophy, this very rigid idea about where things go, and we're just kind of turning around to say, hey, we just want to make apps that work and stop worrying about this for a little bit. But music history didn't end with modal jazz. And one of the things that came after it was this idea of musicians returning to the really, really core first principles of music. And I'm like talking about the stuff that existed before notation, even before the words Ionian or Lydian or Mixolydian were coined by the poor people who got their tunes co-opted for 4,000 years or something. And instead of like thinking about chords even, they just started thinking about silence and noise. And they started thinking about clusters of tones that previously had been thought were like not really great to go together. And that was sort of the era of free jazz. And it's one of the things that I think is super cool and super interesting to check out, especially in a live setting, maybe not so much in a recorded setting, but to each their own. And I think that we largely are finding ourselves in a similar situation where in the lack of like clear direction, where it's not like, React and Vue aren't really saying like, hey, the data to these things has to go there. We need to fall back upon first principles and the foundations of things that work. And I think taking a look at what the intentions of Trevig's model view editor thing were intending to solve is kind of can provide some help. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about, I think, some state takeaways that are that could be relevant to our day to day. And so first, use state sparingly. So the whole issue with that MVC or MVET was MVET was intending to solve was like, hey, we've got all of this business logic that is entangled directly with our view logic, right? And so the best way to avoid entanglement is just to avoid entirely. And so while, I made that glib joke at the beginning of the presentation saying, hey, this is the first thing that you do on every day of your new job. You get handed a diagram that outlines the entire state of the entire application and how it's used. Like, it's really something that we need to be doing, and we need to be taking a look at that, and we need to be seeing what parts of it are duplicated and can be trimmed down, maybe represented in normalization, which means that we don't store it we don't store it in a fully processed way when we are storing it, but we keep it in a normalized form. And then we do transformations at the point where that state is needed instead of at the source, which prevents us from, having a car at the oil drilling well when what we really need is, an electric bike, which is probably still made out of oil. We really should perform data transformations through simple functions and prioritize transparency and documentation over co-location. And so instead of trying to like really dry up our code and make this like really beautiful like single state transformation that gets used everywhere, understand that your product owners are going to ask for the application to change like every single day. And so that like exercise is not going to be super useful, but instead keeping it in this raw normalized form and then repeating transformations as necessary is great. Finally, when you have functions that do data transformations over your code, when you need the data a little bit differently in a different spot, it's pretty tempting to just like add a switch statement or an if statement and return like one kind of state over here and return one kind of state over there. But consider just writing like two functions, calling the original function inside the second function, and then returning something else. That way you don't need to worry about messing up whatever your colleagues did, and you can still get the benefits of what they used, and it's also very explicit that you're using them, and so if somebody goes and changes that function, they can go through and they can easily just do a Command-Shift-F and find like, hey, this is used over here, I should probably take that into account. This one is, I think, my most favorite and most important. Cater data transformations to component APIs, not the other way around. If you have a thing that is called like document requester and it's being passed an array of all requests in the entire application, you might think to yourself, why does a single document request need to know about every other single request? And if I was writing a document request API, what is the actual like thing that I wish I had if I was provided this from somebody else? And when you do that, what it does is it makes obvious what type of shape the state is needed at the component level just from reading the definition of a component or a function if you're in a different land. And it also helps you automatically divorce the state transformation from the markup. Even though we can put that directly into the component right above the little render or the return, like we don't have to. And then socialize at your places of work to never assume that state isn't changed. That any time that you modify a piece of state, the reality is that for better or worse, that state could be hoisted up all the way to the very top of the application and used in every single other component, or it could be shared through context or Redux or one of its siblings anywhere. So when you make a modification to that state, even if you're doing so in a mutable way, you need to take a look and see where that state is used everywhere. And it's tedious, but it's the responsible thing to do. And for the end of my talk, I'm going to say, remember Miles Davis and John Coltrane. If you're having a hectic day, there's different music for every person, but there's at least something worthwhile and interesting. It might be helpful to jump on Wikipedia and read about these before just jumping in, but also just jump on in. And even if you forget everything about React and state and MVC and editors and things, you'll walk away with two amazing albums that have changed the way people listen to and play music. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of Utah.js.